Imagine this for a moment. A U.S. aircraft carrier sits off the coast of Venezuela. Oil tankers are being seized in the Caribbean. Political prisoners are being released slowly, partially, under pressure. And then, with a single post on social media, the President of the United States says, "I canceled the second wave of attacks. I'm Fareed Zakaria. And what you're watching unfold is not a crisis. It's a strategy. Power today doesn't always arrive with bombs. Sometimes it comes with leverage, oil contracts, naval fleets, and the quiet promise of peace, so long as cooperation continues." The question isn't whether Venezuela complied. The question is who now controls its future. If you want to understand how modern power really works, how wars are paused, not ended, stay with me. This story matters far beyond Caracas. Because what's happening here is part of a much larger design. And to see it clearly, we need to step back and define the real problem at the heart of this moment. What exactly is happening here? On the surface, this looks like de-escalation. No second wave of attacks, talks of reopening embassies, the release of detainees. But beneath that surface is a far more consequential shift. The United States is no longer just pressuring Venezuela. It is restructuring the terms of its survival. Washington is deciding who sells Venezuelan oil, who profits from it, and who provides security. American companies are told they don't need to deal with Caracas at all. They deal with the United States. At the same time, U.S. warships remain in place. The threat is paused, not removed. Peace exists, but only conditionally. This is not diplomacy as we once understood it. It's not regime change either. It is something in between. A system where sovereignty is negotiated under the shadow of force. To understand how we arrived at this moment, why Venezuela became so vulnerable, and why oil sits at the center of everything, we have to look backward before we can look forward. That story begins long before this carrier appeared offshore. To understand this moment, you have to understand Venezuela's long arc of dependency and isolation. For decades, oil was not just Venezuela's economy. It was its state, its diplomacy, its political glue. When oil prices were high, the system held. When they collapsed, everything else followed. Sanctions then accelerated a collapse that was already structural. Capital fled, infrastructure decayed, diplomacy froze. By 2019, the United States no longer recognized the government in Caracas. Embassies closed, dialogue stopped. Venezuela became politically radioactive and economically desperate. That vacuum created a new reality. Without access to capital or markets, oil stopped being leverage for Venezuela. It became leverage against it. And so the balance flipped. The United States could apply pressure without invasion, naval presence without war, recognition without legitimacy. By the time military action was openly discussed, Venezuela's real vulnerability was no longer tanks or troops. It was dependency. Oil still mattered, but control mattered more. And that imbalance is what made the next moment inevitable. Because once pressure builds long enough, it doesn't resolve quietly. It erupts. Then came the rupture. U.S. forces didn't announce a war. They acted. An oil tanker was seized in the Caribbean. Then another. By Friday morning, a fifth vessel, the Olina, was intercepted, falsely flying a foreign flag, launched from an American aircraft carrier stationed off Venezuela's coast. This was not symbolic. It was operational. At the same time, Washington made its message unmistakably clear. Military plans existed. A second wave of attacks was expected, and Venezuela knew it. Within hours, the response came. Political detainees were released, an important number, according to the government. Human rights groups would later confirm only a fraction, but the signal mattered more than the math. Then the announcement, the attacks were canceled, not because the threat disappeared, but because cooperation had begun. This is how modern pressure works. Escalation followed by restraint. force followed by conditional mercy. If you're still watching, pause for a second and ask yourself, was this a concession or a transaction? Because what looked like relief was actually a pivot. And that pivot leads us to the mechanism most people miss. Here is the mechanism hiding in plain sight. The United States did not just threaten Venezuela. It replaced it. American oil executives were told something extraordinary. They would get security. They would get guarantees. They would get access to up to 50 million barrels of Venezuelan oil. But they would not deal with Caracas. They would deal with Washington. This is the core of the system now taking shape. Political authority on paper remains Venezuelan. Economic authority, however, is being externalized. The state still exists, but the decisions that matter, investment, security, access, are made elsewhere. Military power enforces the perimeter. Diplomacy manages the optics. Oil provides the incentive. It's not occupation. It's not partnership. It's managed sovereignty, and once that model appears, it doesn't stay contained. It creates expectations. It creates precedents. Because if this can work in Venezuela, it can work elsewhere, which is why the next escalation didn't point inward. It pointed outward toward the region. The pressure didn't stop at Venezuela's border. Almost immediately, the signal spread across the region. Colombia's president revealed that in a private call, Donald Trump warned of bad things being planned. Military options, preparations already underway. The implication was chillingly simple. What happened to Caracas was not unique. It was repeatable. At the same time, another door opened. Joint operations against the ELN, a guerrilla group turned cartel. 6,000 fighters moving easily across borders, exploiting weak sovereignty on both sides. Here, escalation took a different form. Not regime change, but cross-border force. Not diplomacy, but coordinated strikes. This is the second crisis. Not a single flashpoint, but a widening circle. Drug boats were hit in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific. More than 100 people killed since September. Land strikes were openly discussed, Mexico mentioned by name. What ties these moments together is not ideology. It's capability. Power is being reasserted through mobility, speed, and optionality. The ability to act, then pause, to threaten, then redirect. And for governments watching from the region, the message is unmistakable. Alignment is no longer theoretical. It is enforced, which brings us to the people who live inside these systems. The ones who don't control carriers, oil contracts, or phone calls between presidents. If you live inside Venezuela, this doesn't feel like strategy. It feels like waiting. Waiting to see if a name is on a release list. Waiting to see if a prison gate opens or stays shut. Waiting to see whether peace lasts another day. If you're a family member of a political detainee, leverage is not an abstract concept. It's time. It's uncertainty. It's the quiet cruelty of partial concessions, some freed, many left behind. If you're an ordinary citizen, oil deals don't mean prosperity. They mean outsiders deciding when stability returns and on what terms. You're told the future is improving. That security is coming. That reconstruction is possible. But it isn't yours to negotiate. This is the human cost of managed sovereignty. Life lived under conditional calm, where war can resume with a post and peace depends on compliance. If this story feels distant, it isn't. Because the logic being tested here, pressure first, rights later, travels easily. If you believe people should not be bargaining chips in geopolitical deals, remember this moment. Share it. Talk about it. Because silence is the one thing this system relies on. And what's happening to Venezuelans today will shape how power treats civilians everywhere tomorrow. Zoom out now. What's happening in Venezuela is not an isolated episode. It's a signal to the international system. When a superpower can seize ships, manage oil flows, suspend attacks, and reopen embassies all at once, it demonstrates something powerful. control without conquest. Other governments are watching closely in Latin America, in energy-dependent states, in countries where sovereignty is already fragile. The message is clear. If you sit on strategic resources, especially oil, your domestic politics are no longer just domestic. They become negotiable assets in a global marketplace of power. This reshapes diplomacy. Embassies reopen not because legitimacy is restored, but because leverage is optimized. Human rights become variables. Elections become timelines, not principles. And once this model proves effective, it spreads. Today, it's Venezuela. Tomorrow, it's any state where security gaps, illicit networks, and valuable resources overlap. This is how regional order is being rewritten. Not through treaties, not through institutions, but through calibrated pressure applied selectively, reversed strategically, and justified as stability. The world isn't entering a more peaceful phase. It's entering a more managed one. And that raises the most important question of all. What happens next? So let's look forward and be honest about the paths ahead. There are three plausible futures emerging from this moment. The first is the optimistic scenario. Cooperation deepens. Oil infrastructure is rebuilt. Sanctions ease gradually. Political space opens slowly, imperfectly, but enough to stabilize daily life. Elections return, not ideal, but real. Managed sovereignty becomes a bridge, not a cage. The second is the middle path. This is the most likely. Pressure remains permanent. Oil flows, but power stays external. Prisoner releases continue in batches. Diplomacy functions, but legitimacy never fully returns. Venezuela survives, but never truly recovers. Then there is the worst case. Leverage hardens into domination. Compliance slips. Attacks resume. The model spreads to Colombia, to Mexico, to anywhere cartels and resources intersect. Sovereignty becomes conditional everywhere. These futures are not chosen by speeches. They are chosen by systems, by incentives, by who controls risk and who absorbs it. History tells us something uncomfortable. Power rarely gives back what it can manage, which means the final question is not what Venezuela will do. It's what the rest of the world is willing to accept. Because once this model is normalized, it doesn't end with one country. It becomes the rule. This is the insight we're left with. What we are witnessing is not the end of conflict, but the refinement of it. War is no longer declared. It is scheduled, paused, cancelled, reactivated. Oil becomes the currency. Human lives become signals. Sovereignty becomes negotiable. The aircraft carrier off Venezuela's coast is not just a weapon. It's a reminder that peace today is provisional, and that should concern you. Because if stability depends on alignment rather than consent, then no nation is truly secure, only compliant. This is not about Donald Trump or Nicolás Maduro or one country in crisis. It's about a system that is quietly redefining how power works in the 21st century. If you want to understand where this leads, how managed sovereignty could reshape global order, there's more to unpack. This story doesn't end here. Follow, stay engaged, and keep asking the question that matters most. Who really decides when peace begins and when it ends? Because once you see the system, you can't unsee it. And that awareness is where real power starts.